The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, last week we were covering the visit of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi on a four-nation tour to Africa. This week, his counterpart from the United States is also on a four-nation tour of Africa. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken left on Sunday for Cabo Verde, Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Angola. At the time of this recording, he's already been to Cabo Verde, and he's in Côte d'Ivoire, and then he'll be heading to Nigeria and Angola. And it does look like the trips were timed in some way that maybe the United States Secretary of State wanted to take away a little bit of the shine of Wang Yi's first of the year trip that he always makes to Africa. That's a custom that's gone on for 34 years by the Chinese foreign minister. The White House and the State Department have both said that that is not the case. They are not focusing on China. The timing was purely coincidental. Nonetheless, it is an interesting comparison to look at the tone, tenor, and themes that Wang Yi brought up in his tour, and now Blinken is bringing up in his. You wrote about this today. What is your thoughts in terms of Blinken versus Wang Yi doing their tours of Africa?
I think in both cases, they're avoiding controversy as much as they pushing particular talking points. So in the case of, as you mentioned, the Blinken entourage, they're not particularly mentioning China. He is particularly not mentioning China, and is focusing on security and on economic development. With Wang's trip, it was a little bit difficult to say what exactly he focused on, simply because, a lot of it was highly coded in the readouts, and we didn't see very concrete announcements of new initiatives. On Wang Yi's side, I think a lot of the work was dovetailing with and feeding into the FOCAC process. That's the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit, the big Africa-China summit that's coming up later in 2024. On the Blinken side, the Atlantic placement of all these visits was interesting for me. And then, the security focus seemed to be a little bit more explicit than the Chinese side, which I think was also security focused. But both trips are notable in the sense that they landed around the Sahel, quite a lot of them. But I think on the, on the American side, there seemed to be more explicit addressing of these issues, in the prelim up to the trip. We haven't seen it much addressed directly within the trip, but even if just in the readouts and announcements, that seemed to be some of the focus in a more open way than it was on the Chinese side, even though it seemed to be a preoccupation on both sides. What did you think?
Yeah, certainly security was a key focus, but how they define security is very interesting, because one of the themes that emerged from Wang's tour, not only in Africa, but also later when he went to Brazil and also to Jamaica, was the idea of sovereignty security, and that China will protect the sovereignty of these different countries. And that, again, is a coded message against U.S.-led multilateralism. And the Chinese are very, very consumed with the idea of protecting their own national sovereignty, and then really try to encourage other countries to do that as a way of pushing back on the U.S.-led multilateral system. Quick question for you, though, before we get into some of the great power competition themes, is that it was unusual, we noted last week, that Wang Yi went to Egypt, because normally the Chinese foreign minister doesn't go to the same country twice in 2 years. This time, we've noted that both Wang Yi and Blinken went to Ivory Coast. That, too, is unusual, that a country gets a visit from both of these foreign ministers. Why do you think Ivory Coast is such a popular destination for the U.S. and China this year?
On the China side, that's been quite difficult to pass for me, even though there's been some significant Chinese projects there. I think one of the key reasons, I think for both of them, was that Ivory Coast just remains as kind of, a kind of a financial center in West Africa. On the US side, they have a large embassy complex in Abidjan. It's a kind of a significant kind of like foothold for the US, I think, in West Africa. And I think Côte d'Ivoire has been this kind of interesting kind of outlier in the region in that it's avoided a wave of coups that have moved through West Africa. It's focused on in interesting ways on economic development, and so I think both China and the US probably see them both as a kind of financial center. I think the African Development Bank is headquartered there, if I'm not incorrect. So kind of a financial center, but also as a kind of a bit of a haven of stability in West Africa at the moment when, stability is hard to find in that region.
The Blinken-Wang visits highlight the nature of great power competition as it is today. Clearly, Africa and West Africa this year is a theater of that competition. And again, they may not be talking directly about each other anymore the way that they did 4 or 5 years ago, but there are clearly subtext to everything that's going on here with these two visits. Well, it's happening in Africa, it's happening a lot more in Southeast Asia. And in countries like Vietnam, they're not only getting high-level visits. Vietnam last year was the only country in the world that got a visit from both Biden and Xi in the same year. And I think that speaks to the challenges that are being faced by many countries in Southeast Asia as they navigate this much more perilous terrain that they're in. Cobus, you and I have talked about on many occasions that as middle power countries, small countries, developing countries try to better understand where and how to position themselves in this new geopolitical environment, that Southeast Asia in many respects offers some guideposts because they have been dealing with great power competition, specifically with the Chinese, and again, with the Americans too, in many respects, as is in the case of Vietnam, for a lot longer. And at the same time, it doesn't feel like that the rest of the global South looks to Southeast Asia for guidance on this. And I think that's a missed opportunity. And specifically, Vietnam has a lot to offer the rest of the world in terms of its lived experience with both the U.S. and the Chinese as occupiers and now as political influencers.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I agree with you that I think there's scope for a lot more kind of cross-learning, kind of from Vietnam's experience. It's because it's not only that they don't only manage these powers by keeping their heads low. Many countries do that. They actually proactively kind of dealing with them in many ways, and actually upgraded their ties with the US and Japan last year. And then had a kind of a symbolic meeting with Xi, which was coded as an upgrade of ties. But, I didn't 100% kind of get whether that was 100% true. But, the kind of larger point being that they're interesting in proactively kind of pursuing different kinds of cooperation with all of these powers without really finding themselves forced into a corner of having to toe anyone's particular line, so, which I think is probably also indicative of their kind of economic clout in that region.
You're absolutely right that there were a lot of upgrades last year in diplomatic ties between the Vietnamese and some of the major powers. But the way, as you pointed out, there's some confusion on what they did specifically with the Chinese. And that's why I am just so thrilled that I had the chance this week to speak with Khang Vu, who's a doctoral candidate in the political science department at Boston College. And he's also a regular columnist for the Asia-Pacific news site The Diplomat and the Loe Interpreter, where he writes on Vietnamese foreign policy. He's also prolific on X, where he provides some of the most insightful commentary and analysis on Vietnamese foreign policy, and just for the reasons that you specified in terms of how are the Vietnamese managing all of this, their various relationships with the Chinese and the U.S. I wanted to speak with him because, again, I think there's a lot that everybody else can learn from the Vietnamese in how they're dealing with the great power rivalries and the relationship between the United States, China, and the other regional powers. So let's take a listen to my interview with Khang Vu from Boston College. Khang Vu, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the show today to talk about China and Vietnam. It's great to finally meet you after I've been a longtime follower of your writing. in The Diplomat and also in the Lowy Interpreter and, of course, on X as well. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Eric. I'm glad to be joining you on this podcast for today.
It's a really opportune time to have the chance to speak with you because there's been so much that's been going on in Vietnamese foreign policy over the past 12 to 18 months. There's been a lot of changes. We've seen a real flurry of activity by the Vietnamese to upgrade their diplomatic relations with the United States, with Japan. There's been recent upgrades as well with South Korea, talks with Australia, India. And at the same time, of course, we can't forget that the last visit of the year in 2023 was with Chinese President Xi Jinping, where they too announced an upgrade of ties. And so maybe you can talk to us about where we are in this moment of history, because Vietnam has been at the center of great power rivalries, not just for the past few years, but for the past few thousands of years. The Chinese, of course, occupied Vietnam for 1,000 years. Then the Japanese were there. The French were colonialists. The Americans were there. So help us understand a little bit about the moment that we're in when it comes to Vietnam and how it sees the world.
So I think to begin with, we would look at Vietnamese history from at least 1945, the foundation of the modern government in Hanoi. We had the French period, which is from 45 to 54, the period with the American from 54 to 75, and the period with the Soviet Union from 79 to 91. And then now it's pretty much a neutral and independent Vietnam. So in each of these periods, I see several interesting trends. So in all of these periods, we see that Vietnam is being pretty much a battleground for global power to exert their sphere of influence. From 45 to 54, the French was trying to go back to French Indochina and then to exert their influence on the newly founded state of Vietnam. In 1954 to 1975, the two Vietnamese states, they are fighting for their right to rule the entire Vietnam, and the American intervened on the South Vietnamese side to stop the expansion of communism, and on the North Vietnamese side, they had the support of the Chinese communists, and after that, we had the Soviet Union supporting communist Vietnam to get out of the Chinese orbit. And then after the end of the Cold War, we have Vietnam now free from any military entanglement, is becoming more independent and trying to cultivate more relationship with other countries. So I would say that the current period is quite an anomaly in Vietnamese history because many times, at least in 1945, Vietnam has always been aligned, formally allied with another great power. So let's say from 45 to 54, Vietnam was an ally of the Chinese communists. 54, 75 against with the Chinese communists and the Soviet Union. From 79 to 91, it was with the Soviet Union, and now is the very first time that Vietnam is truly neutral and truly an independent country. So when we see that this is the very first time that Vietnam is truly neutral and non-aligned, we start to understand why Hanoi is trying to cultivate these ties with a lot of countries besides great powers like China, Russia, or the United States. From the Vietnamese perspective, it is really good to have a lot of friends. So in the past, especially in the years from 1977 to 1991, Vietnam was pretty much a target of the Chinese containment policy. Pretty much China wants to isolate Vietnam internationally, especially isolate Vietnam from other Southeast Asian country and Asian country to really starve Vietnam and actually to teach Vietnam a lesson. So coming from that kind of painful history, Vietnam decided that like, hey, we don't need to actually just depend on China or Russia or the United States. Why don't we make good friends with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, with other Southeast Asian countries? These countries, they have no territorial ambitions against Vietnam. These countries, they don't have the ambition or the intention to invade Vietnam. So at the same time, these countries, they have the economic power, they have the expertise, and they also have the Asian experience to help Vietnam build a modernized country. So I think that when we look at the modern period as a period of Vietnam being an independent and non-aligned country, then all of these multilateral and all of these partnerships start to make sense.
Yeah, scholars like yourselves and analysts call Vietnam's strategy a multi-directional strategy. You've written that it's an omnidirectional strategy. And some people use the colorful description that it's bamboo diplomacy. And bamboo diplomacy, bamboo is this idea that bamboo bends but never breaks, and it bends with the wind. And so Vietnam's foreign policy has been very adept at moving with the times. So you've pointed out that it's neutral, it's independent. Again, there's been these very big upgrades with the major powers. Again, Japan and the United States are the most notable towards the end of last year. But at the end of the day, China still plays an outsized role in Vietnamese foreign policy. Tell us about the comparison between how the Vietnamese in Hanoi view China versus how they view, say, the partnerships with other major powers like the US and Japan.
So I would say that China is and always will be the most important foreign policy partner of Vietnam, not even just the Vietnamese government right now since 1945, but if every keen reader of Vietnamese history will know that for the entirety of Vietnamese existence, it's always been about China. Vietnam fought for its independence from China, and during 8,000 years of occupation, it was a Chinese occupation. And after that 1,000 years of occupation, Vietnamese leaders has always been fighting against northern invaders. But at the same time, I want to stress that Vietnamese emperors, they also are the masters of balancing. Basically, whenever they ran into trouble with the Chinese, they always send a message to the Chinese that we Vietnamese, we respect the Chinese leadership. We respect the Celestial Empire. We don't want to disrespect China. But if China ever infringe on our territorial sovereignty, then we would be really ready to fight back. But that is not a way to say that Vietnam is always caving into Chinese pressure. Vietnam is always trying to chart its own path, independent of China. But to some degree, that would not upset China. So I would say that the modern Vietnamese foreign policy is not that much different. Modern Vietnamese leaders, they understand the importance of China as a economic partner, but also the danger of upsetting China. It was a lesson that they learned from 1977 till 1991 that upsetting China by aligning with the Soviet Union was too much of a cost to the economy and a cost to the international profile. So to the Vietnamese right now, they see that let's play nice with China. Let's communicate to China that Vietnam want to be friends with China. Vietnam want to make peace with China. But at the same time, Vietnam is really ready to reach out to China's rivals, such as Japan and the United States, as a safety belt in case China really break its commitment, break its promises to not hurt Vietnam. So in that situation, I would say that Vietnam bamboo diplomacy is really an answer to that problem. So when we talk about bamboo diplomacy, we often talk about two major factors. The first one, the bamboo always had firm roots, and second, it has flexible branches. So what does firm root even mean? So firm root here can be understood simply as Vietnamese autonomy. Vietnam will never compromise when it comes to its autonomy, when it comes to its territorial integrity. But flexible branches here, simply think about that as a multi-directional foreign policy. Vietnam want to be friends with many other countries. Vietnam want to be friends with China. Vietnam want to be friends with the United States. Vietnam want to be friends with Russia. But whenever each of these countries threaten Vietnamese interests, then they would be ready to bend, to balance against that threat and to make friends with any country that would help Vietnam defend its national interests.
It's very confusing to try and read Vietnamese politics on this, and it's why a lot of people outside of Vietnam oftentimes misread the situation. And so I'd like to see if you can help clarify some of the contradictions. So on the one hand, you've talked about how the Vietnamese recognize the asymmetry in the relationship, that China is a big power, Vietnam is a fraction of its size, and so it has to use deterrence in many respects as a way to get its way. On the one hand, though, when you see the general secretaries of Vietnam and the Chinese Communist parties get together, they look like the best of friends. At the same time, this is a country in Vietnam that has territorial disputes in the South China Sea, East Vietnam Sea, that continue to roil relationships. And a lot of people on the street in Vietnam still have a lot of suspicions of China. At the same time, when Prime Minister Chin went up to see Xi Jinping last year, he did it at the same time when he docked a U.S. aircraft carrier in Da Nang, sending a message to President Xi that says, we've got some very powerful friends. Check out what's parked in our backyard. And these conflicting messages are very interesting to try and sort through. Can you help us untangle the harmony that we see in the diplomacy, the tensions we see sometimes over territorial disputes, and the complex signaling that different parts of the Vietnamese leadership send to Beijing?
So I would say that the very heart of this puzzle is actually Vietnam-China policy. So Vietnam-China policy, at least in the period after 1991, the year that Vietnam and China normalized diplomatic relations, is that Vietnam would adopt a dual strategy towards China. So one is a policy of assurance, and the other is a policy of deterrence. So when it comes to the policy of assurance, Vietnam would communicate to China that, hey, we do not have any bad intention toward China. We always consider China as our most important partner. We always respect Chinese national interests, and our relationship with many other powers, extra-regional powers, do not constitute an anti-China policy. So the key logic of the policy of assurance is pretty much to prevent China from adopting an anti-Vietnam policy that China adopted in 1977, which was to bleeding Vietnam white. So Vietnam want to make sure that China would not punish it for just a normal upgrade in Vietnam-Japanese tie, for example. So that policy of assurance is what we see most of the time, is that Vietnamese leader would often make calls with Chinese leaders saying that they cherish the party-to-party tie, they cherish the state-to-state tie between Vietnam and China, and they reassure China that, again, Vietnamese foreign policy do not constitute an anti-China policy. That is one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is Vietnam policy of deterrence against China. So this has to boil down to the possibility of that, hey, there is a chance that the policy of assurance may fail, right? Like Vietnamese leaders don't know when the Chinese leaders stop believing in them. Like we don't know that China will launch a war against Vietnam in the future, especially when it has been upset for some reason that we are not aware of. So Vietnam want to make sure that if their policy of assurance fails, they have something to fall back on. And that's when the policy of deterrence actually comes in. The policy of deterrence is pretty simple. Vietnam is trying to modernize its own military. That's why we have the Arms Defense Expo in late 2022. And at the same time, Vietnam is trying to cultivate closer relations with the United States, Japan, and trying to maintain a friendly relationship with Russia to maintain a steady flow of arms purchase. So I would say that the essence, the ultimate objective of the two policy of assurance and deterrence is, again, for Vietnam to prevent a second war with China, another one after 1979. So Vietnam always want to be friendly with China. Vietnam doesn't want war. Vietnam want to maintain a stable economic development so that it can grow its economy. And as you know, that Vietnam is hitting pretty much the top of its population growth right now. So maybe Vietnam will not get rich before it gets old. So right now it's really important for the Vietnamese leadership to maintain a peaceful environment for economic development. And to do that, they implement the policy of assurance and the policy of deterrence towards China to maintain a state of peace, at least on the land border between Vietnam and China. The sea border may be a different story, but so far we have seen that both countries had tried to contain their disagreement at sea to some level and to not let any maritime disagreement to blow up into a hot war between Vietnam and China.
And this relationship operates at a couple of different levels. So there is the party-to-party relationship, and then there is the state-to-state relationship. And maybe you could help explain that. And this party relationship is very important because we see that when Xi Jinping came to Hanoi last year, he came with carrying two hats and two roles, one as the Communist Party General Secretary and the other as the head of state. His first meeting in Hanoi was with his counterpart, Yuan Fuchong, and at the same time, that was a reciprocal visit to the first meeting in Beijing that she had after COVID, was also with the General Secretary Chong. So it's very interesting to see how that party-to-party relationship operates separate from the state-to-state relationship. And I'm also curious, as a tangent to this question as well, that Vietnam has power centers that are very different than China's. They're separated, whereas all the power in China, for the most part, in the leadership, boils up to Xi. But in Vietnam, there's the president, the prime minister, the general secretary, and the head of the National Assembly. Power is much more diffuse. How does that interact with China as well? So how do these two governments work with each other is the bottom line.
So I would say that Vietnam and China enjoy a really special relationship because, as you say, that Vietnam and China enjoy a party-to-party and a state-to-state relationship. So I would say that these two levels, even though they seem to be distinct, but I would say that they are quite similar because Vietnam and China, after all, they are party-state, which means that the party and the state are pretty much fused together. You have party members working in state positions, and you have state bureaucrats sometimes change their job from the state to the party position. So I would say that even though we can clearly see there is a party-to-party and state-to-state channel, in reality, they are much more fused together. So what I would say, the thing is why the distinction is important here. So I would say that the party-to-party relation is more about ideology, while the state-to-state relation is more about the side of the state in general. So when we talk about that, we will have to go a little bit into the IR, the international relations understanding of these two channels. So based on what I understand about China-Vietnam relation, the party-to-party relation is often a way for Vietnam and China to communicate their messages and especially for Vietnam to communicate its assurance with China that, hey, whenever we do something that you may not like, but we are still communist comrades, so we will not harbor any bad intention toward China. So a lot of the time when we see Vietnam and China meeting, party-to-party meetings, we see that the Vietnamese and the Chinese, they repeat a lot of time that Vietnam and China, they are communist comrades, and they cherish the relationship, and they hope that they can fall back on this party-to-party channel to manage different sea. But at the same time, we see the state-to-state channel. So I would say that in the case of Vietnam and China, the state-to-state channel is actually of a lower level than the party-to-party channel, because originally, when we date back to the 1940s, the late 1940s, it was the party-to-party relation between Ho Chi Minh, Viet Minh, and Mao Zedong, Communist Party, that make the first contact. So when these two Communist Party, they made the first contact, they were already good allies, good comrades back then. So when Mao Zedong established his Communist China in 49 and Ho Chi Minh established Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 45, you pretty much have the two Communist Party to become the two communist governments. So the state-to-state here is just a natural outgrowth of the already existing party-to-party relationship. I would say that the state-to-state here is just a way for these Vietnam and China to really make their international agreement, make their state visit to comply with international standard, because we all know this is a world order made up of state, not a party. So the state-to-state here is just a way for these two governments to conduct relation on the basis of the modern Westphalian system. But the party-to-party channel is actually at the heart of Vietnam-China relation. I would not say that we can reject the state-to-state channel completely in favor of the party-to-party. But whenever we read Vietnam and China statement, it's really important to understand that this is not just an interstate relation, but an interstate relation born out of an existing party-to-party relation dating back since at least the 1940s.
So given the depth and the breadth of the Vietnam-China relationship, when the United States and Japan and other powers seek to engage the Vietnamese, do they come to that understanding knowing that they will never be at the same level of the Chinese? Or do you get the sense that the Americans and others feel like there's a chance to pull Vietnam into, for lack of a better way of describing it, their sphere of influence or on their side? When I go to Washington, I oftentimes get questions from senior American stakeholders to say, do you think Vietnam is more aligned with us or more aligned with China? And they see it in that kind of binary way. But it doesn't sound like the Vietnamese are ever going to abandon the depth of their relationship with the Chinese, both at the party level and at the state level, or to prioritize the U.S. or Japan over the Chinese. So look at it from the Western perspective and the Japanese perspective in terms of their approach to Vietnam.
So I would say that this is a really timely question. And throughout my writings, I've been using the example of Vietnam-Soviet Union's alliance as my answer to why Vietnam will never give the United States or Japan that high level of diplomatic relations. So back in the 1970s and 1980s, Vietnam made the bet between China and the Soviet Union. So the Vietnamese leadership back then bet that they could rely on the Soviet Union to really escape the Chinese orbit. And for a while, that worked. The Soviet Union was a massive provider of arms and of economic support to the Vietnamese government throughout the 1980s that helped Vietnam withstand the Chinese coercion. But in the end, the Chinese coercion was just too strong because China and Vietnam share a really long land border, and Vietnam is just a fraction of Chinese power. So throughout the late 1980s, especially beginning 1986, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev actually started to see Vietnam as more of a burden, more than an asset. So he started to mend the fences with the Chinese and pretty much abandoned Vietnam in the process. So in 1991, pretty much after being abandoned by the Soviet Union, Vietnam had to come to terms with the fact that there is no way they could withstand the Chinese coercion. There's no way that they could trust any other power. There's no way that they could make China angry and then live peacefully. So the lesson that Vietnam got from that decade of 1980s is that whether they like it or not, China will always be their neighbor. China will always be stronger than Vietnam. Vietnam can never withstand Chinese coercion on its own. So I would say here that if we apply that lesson to the modern period, Vietnam understands the risk and the cost of Chinese coercion. So even if Vietnam really want to upgrade ties with the United States and even treat the United States as an informal ally or even to the level of a formal ally like it did with the Soviet Union, China would not be happy with that. So I would say that the reason why Vietnam cannot regard the United States as a reliable ally is simply because of Chinese coercion. There is no guarantee for Vietnam that the United States would commit to Vietnam defense for a long term. There is no commitment from other country beside the United States, such as Australia or Japan, that they would be willing to fight a war on Vietnamese soil against China. So in the end, Vietnam again has to face the reality that if a war between Vietnam and China happens, they need to fight China alone. And that is something that they have been really accustomed to at sea, when we see that a lot of time that China bully Vietnam at sea. The United States, Japan, Australia, and many other countries, they only voice their statement of concern. They never intervene on Vietnamese side or Vietnamese behalf. So the Vietnamese leader, they understand that the Chinese coercion or the Chinese pressure is so great that there's no way that Vietnam can ever escape China orbit without any costs. So I would say that Vietnam really want to maintain good relations with the United States and Japan or even Australia, but in the end, it still boils down to whether China is okay with the upgrade.
Yeah, and that Chinese orbit you talk about extends far beyond just the geopolitical and the security realm into everyday life. I've been living in Ho Chi Minh City now for 12 years. And over the past decade, one of the things that I've noticed is just how much more prominent Chinese products, Chinese cars, Chinese services are in our everyday lives there. So when e-commerce just started in Vietnam, about 6-7 years ago on a company called Lazada, anybody in Southeast Asia knows Lazada, or Shopee, it took 10 days to get products brought to your house, and there wasn't a very good logistics system. Alibaba bought Lazada. Now when I buy a product on Lazada, it comes either the same day or the next day, oftentimes directly from China. So there are big warehouses in Yunnan province right over the border for Lazada, these distribution centers like Amazon has here in the United States. And they are selling millions of dollars of goods, almost same day delivery or next day or very quick delivery. And that's all because of the Chinese. We're talking about a lot of Chinese food, fruit, products. I'm seeing Chinese cars now on the street. Beijing cars are starting to show up. BYD is coming with a factory. And so it seems to be part of the strategy from the Chinese point of view is to bind Vietnam economically so that orbit you've talked about is so bound and so tightly wound up through trade, infrastructure investment, new railways they're talking about, that it would be difficult, if not impossible, without a massive disruption to daily life for the Vietnamese to break away from the Chinese orbit. Do you see that happening as well in the economic space?
I think so, yes. So the thing with the Chinese policy towards Vietnam is really multifactorial. So on the one hand, we have the security and the military factor that I mentioned. On the other hand, we also have the economic factor as well. So the Chinese, they understand well that the Vietnamese, they want to maintain a level of economic development, a level of economic prosperity. And they understand that similar to the Chinese communists, that the Vietnamese communists really relied on economic performance for their legitimacy. So whenever we see any meetings between high-level Vietnamese and Chinese official, the Chinese, they always say that we support the continuation and the authority of the Vietnamese Communist Party. And we support the Vietnamese Communist Party reform program. We support the Vietnamese Communist Party economic policy. And one of the way that the Chinese, they signal their support for the Vietnamese economic policy is to actually increase the level of trade with the Vietnamese government. And my statistics is that even in the past decade, Vietnam-China relations seems to be on pretty rocky because of the disagreement over the South China Sea. But Vietnam has been rising as one of China's most important trading partner in Asia. And despite the differences at sea, Vietnam is actually right now China's biggest trade partner from ASEAN. So to tell you that even though we see a lot of differences at sea, the Chinese and the Vietnamese, they see no problem continuing their upward economic cooperation. And the Chinese, they understand that economic trade is also a measure for them to really keep their influence in Vietnam valid, and also a way to raise the cost of the Chinese punishment whenever if the Vietnamese ever side with the Americans against the Chinese, because the lesson from the 1980s shortage embargo was a containment from the Vietnamese perspective. So if Vietnam want to avoid those outcomes, and if Vietnam want to continue enjoying this high level of trade with China, they would better not side with America against China.
Let's close our discussion looking forward to what's ahead in 2024. 2023 was a rather momentous year for Vietnamese foreign policy. In fact, Vietnam, as far as I know, and I looked around, is the only country in the world that hosted both Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in the same year. That didn't happen in any other country. And I think it speaks to the importance that Vietnam has in today's geopolitical environment. The Vietnamese leadership was very busy last year going to Tokyo, welcoming Indian delegations, working with the Indonesians and so forth. In fact, President Jokowi was just in Hanoi a few weeks ago. So it's been a very, very busy hub for diplomatic activity. What are you looking at in terms of 2024 that you think people should focus on with regards to how Vietnam is positioning itself in the great power rivalry?
I would say that the trend from 2023 is actually a trend of polarization, of regional polarization. We see that the United States, Japan, South Korea have been pretty much increasing their trilateral alliance. And on the other side, we see that China, Russia, and North Korea have been increasing their own level of military cooperation against the US-led military bloc in East Asia. So Vietnam is kind of stuck between these two giant military blocs, of which Vietnam has really strong tie with both. So I would say that for 2024, Vietnam will still maintain a level of autonomy and trying to maintain its bamboo diplomacy by maintaining a good level of friendship with China and with that of the United States. So when we look at the statements, the diplomatic statement from the Joe Biden visit to Vietnam and later Xi Jinping visit to Vietnam, I would see that the Vietnamese government put a lot of effort in signaling to both governments that Vietnam cherishes a good relation with both, and Vietnam doesn't want to join any sides against either that is an anti-China or anti-US coalition. So I would say that for 2024, Vietnam will still continue its multi-directional foreign policy, and hopefully that we will see a lot of upgrade to the level of comprehensive strategic partnership that the Vietnamese government promised with several countries from last year, like Indonesia, like Japan, or like Australia. So I hope that 2024, even though it would be a really turbulent year for the region, but I'm really confident that Vietnam will have a solution to make its way through the uncharted territory.
Khang, thank you so much for taking the time to clarify all of this. This is one of the most complex puzzles, as you pointed out, in geopolitics. It requires a tutor like yourself to help us figure out how to put the pieces together. Khang Vu is a doctoral candidate in the political science department at Boston College, and he is also a regular columnist for the Asia-Pacific news site The Diplomat and the Lowy Interpreter, where he writes on Vietnamese foreign policy. Also, Khang, you have one of the best Twitter feeds about Vietnamese foreign policy. Where can people find you on X?
My X is at Khang X Vu. So it's just my name straight out. So it's not complicated. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, and I'll put a selection of Khang's writings from those various publications so you can check it out. And I think you'll become as excited a follower as I am. Once again, Khang, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Eric, and have a great day.
Cobus, what a treat to be able to speak to Khang and to really talk about Vietnamese politics. You know, I've lived there for the past 12 years, and so I'm immersed in it. But when you're actually in it, sometimes you don't see it from the big perspectives, like a guy like Khang who's looking at it both as a Vietnamese, but also from someone from afar, and also someone who is expert in Vietnam-China relations. But given the fact that he's in the United States and he's been in the U.S. now for 12 years, he's had an opportunity to really understand the dynamics of U.S. politics, which is something that I think is often missing by a lot of stakeholders overseas who don't understand the changes that have happened in the United States. And this speaks a little bit to how people in the Vietnamese-Chinese relationship will often see what they want in the geopolitical relationship. So a lot of Americans, as I mentioned in the discussion with Khang, have come to me and said they think that Vietnam is in play. They think that Vietnam can come to their side, quote unquote, the U.S. side, in the event of a conflict with China. And I think that's just a gross misreading of the situation. Countries like Vietnam and many countries in Africa do not want to take sides, will not take sides, and they are working very hard to avoid being pulled into this great power rivalry. That being said, the narratives in Europe, in China, in Africa, and even in Japan to some extent are incredibly powerful. And it gives stakeholders and the broader discourse the opportunity for people to see exactly what they want and ignore some of the geopolitical realities.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a little bit of the, how to put this? There's a little bit of the naivete of the powerful, kind of like at play here, in which when very powerful actors, kind of survey a landscape, they frequently try to kind of like they in the first place, they divide that landscape into what's bad for us and what's good for us, which is frequently a very an unrealistic view of a landscape. But then there's a tendency to connect a few dots and then be like, great, we won, or we can potentially win, which is the same thing as we won. So that I think is at play here. Like, kind of in the first place, I kind of as someone in the global south from a small country, I always strenuously object against this concept of countries being in play, quote unquote. Kind of the chessboard kind of metaphor of geopolitics is always problematic for me. But then beyond that, I think, I see a kind of a similar kind of dynamic here as one finds frequently in discussions around Chinese electrification in Africa. And bear with me, like this is going to a place that makes sense, hopefully. In that when Europe or the US makes a big deal, kind of has some kind of like signs a big deal with an African country for some kind of, kind of form of cooperation in this field, then from the perspective of European and US observers, that is a victory against China. Whereas from the perspective of the African country, frequently, they've just managed to diversify things. China's very much still there. They just also carved out a space for the US. Now they have more of them, on like we have several rich people involved rather than just one rich person involved. So that's what I mean, is that from the global south side, they're trying to keep as many people on board as they can. From the seen from the global north side, they see each of these kind of like advancements as a kind of a victory for them in a zero-sum game where China loses when the US wins, which is like when you look from a global south perspective, it's not that zero-sum game. China can win and the US can win at the same time. But more specifically, what these countries want is to not be dependent on any one of them. So they want a diversification of the landscape and more players in there. And the powerful they have the illusion that each time they win, they're displacing someone else, which isn't always true.
And if you want to see an example of what the narratives that Cobus is talking about, I invite you to go check out an article by Michael Phillips in the Wall Street Journal. It's a terribly written article. It's just really bad, shoddy journalism. There's just no other way to say it. How the U.S. is derailing China's influence in Africa. And again, we're diverting a little bit from our theme on Vietnam and Southeast Asia, but so much of what we're seeing in terms of media coverage in Africa also plays out in Southeast Asia. First of all, this headline, how the U.S. is derailing China's influence in Africa, and what they're talking about, they're playing on the word derailing. It's the Libido Corridor, which is the 1,000-kilometer railway that the U.S. is going to upgrade with a $900 million U.S. Exim Bank loan. A little bit premature for the United States to be crowing about this, and for even the Wall Street Journal to kind of take that kind of headline, given the fact that the United States has not refurbished a single kilometer of rail yet, whereas the Chinese have done more than 10,000 kilometers. Now, that's a standard Chinese talking point, but it also happens to be true. And then there's a line in this article, and there's so much, to disparage about the article. Michael Phillips interviewed the U.S. ambassador, a Pentagon think tank, Alex Vines from Chatham House, and then an Angolan minister, and never once interviewed anybody who could provide some other context for what the Chinese are doing. But you'll see a line in there, which, he says, Joao Lourenço has initiated a sharp tilt toward the West. Now, when you speak to the U.S. ambassador, and you speak to Alex Vines, and you speak to a Pentagon think tank, that's the narrative you're going to get. So I think that's what you're talking about there, is that these are the narratives of the powerful. And there's no dissenting views, there's no challenging views, there's no balance in this story. So I caution everybody when they read these narratives about the U.S. and China competing in places like Angola and Vietnam to look for the balance in the coverage. And to look for, and I'm not talking about anti-American dissenting voices, just people who can bring some context. Context like for the fact that the Libido Corridor still hasn't been built. Context like the fact that there's real doubts in Africa today, as there are in other parts of the world, as to whether or not if a Trump administration comes back to power, they will be able to finish these projects. Real doubts over the fact that the Chinese, yes, they have left a lot of countries saddled with debt, but at the same time, they're negotiating those debt settlements now, whereas a lot of the Western debt from the Eurobonds are struggling in the renegotiation process. Again, that's the context which we talk about. It's very frustrating, Cobus, to read these kinds of stories in Southeast Asia and in Africa as well, because I think they continue to set back the discourse in terms of having a fuller understanding of the complexity of these issues.
Yes, they set back the discourse. More specifically, I think they leave American readers uninformed, but they also specifically don't really kind of grapple with what these countries are managing to do, like with the complexity of these countries' position. And that's not necessarily that surprising, because the Wall Street Journal isn't generally dealing with the complexities of Angola's position. They don't care. But I think both Angola and Vietnam are particularly kind of salient examples of kind of in the weakness of this kind of narrative, because in both countries the Chinese involvement is permanent and structural. It's not, like they, as much as I hate that language, there are countries, like if you're looking at play, quote unquote, countries in the global south, there are several countries in the global south, both in Southern Africa and in Southeast Asia, that can be seen as, quote unquote, at play. Vietnam and Angola are not those countries, because in both of them, China has a semi-permanent, almost 100% permanent structural position in those economies that is not going to go away. In the case of Vietnam, because they're right across the border and they've been integrated for centuries, and they're becoming even more integrated than they've ever been before, like physically, trade-wise, investment-wise, kind of like cross-border migration-wise, many ways. In Angola, because Angola by far has the largest amounts of Chinese debt than any other African country, to the extent that Angola is frequently left out of the math to calculate the debt because it distorts it so much, and because the connection between China and Angola goes back in solid ways back to the Mao days. Zimbabwe is now frequently seen as one of China's most kind of solid allies in Southern Africa, but I think Angola's connection with China is even older, and even, I'm speaking under correction, but but even more, I think, formidable, simply because of the financial connections. The China-Angola relationship is unique in Africa for its weight, its size, its debt load, and as examples of at-play countries go, Vietnam and Angola are particularly weak examples, I think.
That's right. And that's why these countries are very important to look at as case studies for how to manage the great power rivalries. Last December, Angola's foreign minister, Tete Antonio, was in Beijing and signing an investment protection deal, joint bilateral investment protection deal. And you see the bilateral meetings that are happening between China and Angola. It is not accurate to say that China and Angola are somehow weakening and that João Lourenço is tilting towards the West. It's selective reading of this. And again, I want to connect this to Vietnam as well, because I see the same narratives happening as well, that after the Biden visit, it was all about how the United States is pulling Vietnam away from China and into its camp. This binary bilateral thinking is so counterproductive.
Well, that is the greatest example of what I called the naivety of the powerful before, because that narrative gets played in this very optimistic kind of pro-American way, right? Kind of rather than the more realistic reading of it, which is these countries may be poor, but they're canny. And one of the things they're canny about is playing these big kind of illusion-fed superpowers off against each other. So it's very difficult for someone who's very powerful to grant respect to someone weaker who's played them. Right? That's very, people don't like doing that. And this is, I think, clear in both, I think, Chinese and American kind of takes on these countries, is no one ever wants to admit that they've been played. But this is what these countries are good at. This is what Angola and Vietnam is good at. They're good at playing superpowers. That's how they survived.
And don't forget that most of the leaders in power today in both Angola and Vietnam were alive, because they're about our age or older. Were alive when the great powers were fighting in their countries. These memories are fresh.
I mean, Angola still, has unexploded munitions all over its countryside because of this, because of that fight.
And in Vietnam, they're still struggling with the effects of Agent Orange. So the legacies of these Cold War battles are still fresh. And I think for a lot of Americans, that was ancient history. But yet, for the people in power today, they were children when the great powers were fighting in their countries. And I don't know if there is that sobriety in the discussions for a lot of people who kind of consider that.
And also, just as a final thing, what also underlies all of this is this kind of interesting kind of optimism in the US side, or Pollyanna-ishness in the US side, naivete, however you want to spin it. The idea that once these countries, as you say, on the American side, that history has largely been forgotten, right? But the coverage tends to assume that history can be forgotten. Whereas if you're from these countries, that history will never be forgotten. And that's the thing. It's they never forget. They will never forget. 1,000 years from now, they still wouldn't forget.
But it's lived history right now.
Well, exactly.
But forget about 1,000 years. When these leaders were children, this was their lived experience.
Exactly, which means that there's no way that these people are in any kind of simple way thinking American values, we should emulate them, right? No way.
Or Chinese values, we should emulate those. I mean, the same goes for the Chinese. They are as skeptical of the Chinese, too.
Exactly. But keep in mind, in Angola, the ones who were bombing were not the Chinese.
Yes, but I think it is that resistance to the major powers. I think they if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So maybe it's not the Soviets, maybe it's not the Americans of the Cold War, but it's still a major power. And I think there's that certain that instinctive response that comes in. Don't you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in general, generalized, kind of world superpowers, of course. But one specific superpower was directly involved. And that's also not being forgotten. That will never be forgotten.
So we're going to continue our deep dives into Southeast Asia, and I'd love to come back to the topic of Vietnam just because it is so interesting. I live there. I find it a fascinating, amazing country that, again, has so much skill in managing these various rivalries. It's poorly understood by the outside world, and it is a country that I would like to discuss more because I think a lot of people can benefit from their experience in terms of the politics and the strategies and the tactics that they use in managing this relationship. We cover this relationship in depth every day on our site and in our coverage that Cobus and the team produce in our newsletter, our daily analysis that we're producing that's going out to thousands every day in diplomacy, academia, business, activists, nonprofit, and we'd love for you to join our growing reader community. If you'd like to try out the work that we're doing and support agenda-free independent journalism, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. If you are a student or teacher, just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you 50% off links so that you can get that really healthy discount because we love having such a large academic community as part of our readership as well. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another episode of the China Global South podcast. For Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.